Excited to have John Bouman, who's Executive Director, now CEO of the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, a mouthful that's really important, every single word. I've actually been in some of the discussions in the past about how to best brand this organization. It's been around now for 50 years.
Yeah, we have mercy. Call us the Shriver Center if you want. You can skip a number of the words. Yeah.
Now you tell me after I laid this thing out.
It's it is our 50th anniversary. It goes back to the legal services component of the war on poverty, and part of Sergeant Shriver and his team, the brainstorming around that was to create a communications hub for the National Legal Aid Network, so it wouldn't be sort of people sitting in isolated cinder block places in poor neighborhoods, but to be linked together in a communications hub, and that was us. It was called the National Clearinghouse for Legal Services. We sort of reformulated it about 20 years ago into what's now the Shriver Center.
Which is a very important policy center, as much as you are litigants around welfare law and other related things, both state and federal.
So we provide law and policy advocacy on behalf of people in poverty across a range of issues here in Illinois, and we're starting to build networks across many states. We have one called the Legal Impact Network that now includes 32 states, where the groups in those states do what we do in Illinois, and we're trying to coordinate and synchronize the advocacy and build some momentum across states.
So one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation is to try to assess the real impact of this budget stalemate.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed ahead of the show, while we have a budget and some money coming in, we have not fixed the problem. Can you describe in your usual succinct way how much the two-year impasse has impacted people in Illinois?
It's been a complete disaster, basically. And it could have been worse, but it was terrible. And the hardest hit sectors were higher education, which is interesting coming from a guy who wants to bolster the business climate. Most businesses, the first thing they name is an educated workforce. But more hard hit was the human services sector. Community mental health, drug and alcohol treatment, after-school programs, anti-violence programs. It's not like we don't have problems with violence in the streets or appropriately handling people with mental health problems. So instead of treatment and those kinds of alternatives, we now have the county jail being the largest mental health institution in Illinois because there's no place else to go. So those kinds of things, and when the budget restarts, you don't just flip the lights back on. You've lost talent, you've lost programs, you've lost clientele, you've lost continuity of care, you've lost leases. That all has to be built back up. Meanwhile, the same organizations are part of the $15 billion of bills that weren't paid during those 2 years. People provided services in good faith, hospitals, and so on, and the state just stiffed them, didn't pay them because they didn't have a budget. And so there's $15 billion of that. In this new budget, there's authority for the state to borrow up to $8 or $9 billion, which the governor has not yet to decide to do. So even on its face, it's not going to pay down the back bills all the way. There is, fortunately, $5 billion in permanent new revenue, basically restoring the income tax to where it was before Rauner was elected, minus a couple of percentage points, and desperately needed funds, but it's not enough. There needs to be more. And it's not, I'm not saying if the state generates the revenue that it needs to keep its promises on the spending side and make smart investments and so on, have a good university system, have a good school system, we would not be an outlier in terms of tax burden. There's one tax that's higher in Illinois than anywhere else, and that's the property tax. That's not a state tax. The reason the property tax is high is levied by counties because they don't get enough state support.
For schools, our primary constitutional
and other supports that if the state doesn't do it, the localities have to do it, or nobody does it, and you pay with quality of life issues. One of the main reasons why we have high property taxes is because the state is so remiss in supporting things like schools.
John, I was just curious, as you were talking, for the 2 years that the state did not pay its bills, did it have money in its coffers, and did they generate interest on that?
The state has to pay as much as 12 or 13% for under the there's a statute in Illinois that says when the state doesn't pay its bills on time, it has to pay interest. So there's right now on that $15 billion in back bills, there's about $800 million in interest payments due to the vendors who are owed that money. That's enough. $800 million is the annual budget for the entire university system, for example. And so by not doing the bond issuance, even with a bad interest rate, we're paying higher interest by waiting longer to pay these bills. I describe it this way. The budget in FY15, the last time we had a budget, was about $38 billion. Through court orders, special statutes, and so on, actually 90% of it was authorized to be paid. So that's about 36. In that $2 billion gap between 36 and 38, that's where higher ed and human services was. So there wasn't authority to pay that. But the revenue that was coming in was about 32. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't enough money even to pay the bills that were authorized to be paid. And that's why you get the $15 billion in back unpaid bills.
And then
the poor comptroller has to do this juggling act every month to decide who to pay and who not to pay.
We may know more in the next week about whether the bipartisan historic school funding formula redo is going to be overridden, or whether the governor's version of it's going to be approved. It turns out the businessman is not very good at math, that a lot of their projections for how the school funding formula would work were wrong. And in fact, a lot more state districts besides Chicago that he wanted to stick it to might also end up with less money.
Yeah, and well, it's another kind of story of moving the goalposts, too. You never quite know where it's going to land or where the governor wants it to land. The same was true with the whole budget. The story would change as time went by. The difficulty, I think, is that the governor hasn't shifted from campaign mode to governing mode, even for a short period of time. And so it's all tactical. It's all about the next election. It's all about trying to win a majority, in which he resembles the Speaker of the House fairly much.
You're listening to John Bouman of the Shriver Center on Live from the Heartland on 88.7 FM. We are back in the neighborhood this week.
We are.
Along with my colleague Michael James. And I want to bring in the feds on this, because another complication in the state trying to figure out its budget in the middle of the Affordable Care Act debate is major impacts on Medicaid, potentially, and the families and the kids that benefit from those particular programs. That it's mostly pass-through money, but from what I understand, it's impacted by this budget impasse as well.
Well, so Illinois gets billions of dollars in federal money to run the Medicaid program that covers 3 million Illinoisans and over half of the births. And with that money comes requirements. Illinois has to, in fact, run a Medicaid program if they're taking that money. And the Medicaid program has to provide needed health care to the beneficiaries. So because of that, the strings that are attached to the federal money, we were able to go into court and get a court order forcing the state to continue to pay Medicaid during the budget impasse. So those crucial payments were made. If they hadn't been made, hospitals like Mount Sinai, Roseland on the south side, the safety net hospitals would have closed within weeks of the start of the budget impasse 2 years ago. So those court orders and other court orders like it were one of the reasons why I think they passed a budget, because it was the court orders were forcing payments that they would have otherwise wanted to make to things like the state payroll or general state aid to schools. There wasn't enough money to go around. Court orders were prioritizing the health care payments, and it was just a rock and a hard place. And 3 days after we got that court order was when they passed the budget. There are provisions, however, in both President Trump and Speaker Ryan's budget proposals this year, similar to what was in the Affordable Care Act repeal, that would completely blow up the Medicaid system, turn it into a block grant, and essentially take $2 to $3 billion out of federal assistance for this from Illinois. And so if those things were to pass, it not only would completely disrupt and shrink the health system in Illinois, it would affect the whole budget, right? If you take $2 or $3 billion out of critical health care services, and if the state decides to replace that with its own money, then everything else suffers, right? So, I mean, it affects the whole budget. It doesn't just affect the healthcare system.
And what was it I was reading this week about how food stamp allocations might be affected?
Also in their budget proposals, these are far from passing, by the way. There's work to be done there. People should pay attention to this. They want to block grant the food stamp program. Illinois gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year to provide basic food assistance to a wide range of people, seniors, working poor, children, under the food stamp program that's now called SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance. And anyway, that's another one to watch that would deeply hurt Illinois families.
John Bouman, we have a gubernatorial race coming up, and I wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
Well,
who's who, and who do you root for, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I should say that the Shriver Center is the type of nonprofit that does not take sides in contested elections.
Of course.
We may not. So this is Saturday morning. I'm on my own time. And I'm speaking as John Bouman, private citizen, resident of Maywood, Illinois. I think it's an interesting contest. I think the leading candidates on the Democratic side are really an interesting group. I think reliably, progressive for the most part. Pritzker has resources that could compete with Rauner's. Chris Kennedy is also has substantial resources, and but he hasn't been up in the ads yet, so we don't quite know. Daniel Biss is shown promise as a fundraiser, and I know him from working with him as a state senator. He's a very effective legislator. I've worked with Mayor Pawar on the mayor's minimum wage campaign. He is probably sort of the, I think he's trying to do this. He's the sort of Bernie Sanders kind of inheritor. I think Daniel Biss would say that too. And so it's an interesting lineup. On the Republican side, of course, it's the incumbent. And he's got a lot to answer for. It's a very interesting situation. He's relying heavily on a deep, deep pocket that he's willing to reach into, and he's got billionaire friends who also are helping. And he's also relying on trying to blame Speaker Madigan for all of the misfortune that's happened on Governor Rauner's watch. And that's the gamble that he's making, is that he can successfully shift the blame to Mike Madigan and identify all the Democratic candidates, no matter who they are, as tools of Speaker Madigan.
So as we let you move on to your Saturday, I have to ask before you leave quickly, what about them Cubs?
Oh.
It was not a good first half,
Listen,
and now...
you know what? I'm so grateful that the concern about the Cubs is that they might not win the World Series. Right? Having spent my whole life having other concerns about the Cubs. The fact that they're relevant year in and year out, and we get to have those kind of worries, which I have, by the way. I'm deeply concerned. I love it. I'm grateful for it, and I'm not somebody who's going to complain and call for people to be fired just because they're having a tougher year this year than last.
We do like those Cubs, and on the citywide front, the White Sox have won 4 in a row.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, John, we want to thank you for coming on live from the Heartland, and
Pleasure.
we hope to have you back, see how your predictions and your, these things bear out over time.